Church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and I'm delighted that you're listening to this podcast. I had a doctor's appointment today, not long before recording this podcast, and they were asking me, what are you going to talk about today? And I told them, and they immediately said, hey, give us a couple of your cards. We might want to tune in and listen to that podcast. So I hope it's as interesting as they thought it was going to be, and we'll say something to you. We're in a time where crazy things are happening. You know, these protests on the college campuses in support of the terrorist group Hamas and Palestine continue. These protesters have sometimes blocked streets and interstates and bridges. There was even an attempt in Florida to try to create a block to Disneyland. I think that met with some pretty aggressive reaction on the part of the authorities. So what should be troubling, though, to all of us is seeing these protesters interviewed who do not even understand what the slogans that they're chanting mean, and certainly do not understand what the issues are in Israel's war against this terrorist group, Hamas. I want to stress that Israel is not at war with Palestine and the Palestinian people. They are trying to eliminate the terrorist group Hamas, who has pledged to efforts to eliminate the Jewish people who attacked Israel in October, slaughtering men, women, and children, even infants. It was a horrific, just a horrific event. So we wonder, what in the world is going on when young people are willing to protest in the streets and on college campuses, and they don't even understand what the chaos and the confusion is all about? What's going on? The scripture teaches us that God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. 1 Corinthians 14:33. And then, it's just the message that Christians ought to model the order of God and deny chaos. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Psalm 34:14. And then in Colossians 3:15, we're instructed to let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, we are called to peace. Peace. Now, I have to just assume that many of these protesters are not Christians, and they don't realize what God has instructed us regarding chaos and confusion. So, if they don't understand the issues that have caused them to join the protest crowds on campuses in the streets, again, you ask the question, what in the world is going on? A few days ago, I saw an article that announced Anarchists at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., referred to the group as Anarchists, that they were calling for the beheadings of school administrators amid their continued anti-Israel encampment. And these protesters on campus, they called for the guillotine to be used on the George Washington University president and other school administrators. Guillotine, 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 guillotine was chanted by the demonstrators. Now, these these agitators created chaos on the George Washington University campus, erecting tents and displaying Palestinian flags and defacing the statue of the campus's namesake, former President George Washington, by pasting Free Palestine stickers over the statue and draping it with the Palestine flag. It's just interesting to me to note that these protesters seem to be suffering a lack of knowledge of U.S. history. They should know that it's the genius and the courage and the great sacrifice of men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison and John Hancock and others that really gave them the right to protest. Now, sadly, it's a right, this right to protest, that many have shamed with violence and vandalizing of property. The students and anarchists are often funded by outside sources from the far left agenda. This is being reported regularly in the news, even mentioning who some of these supporters are. Well, what do we mean by anarchist and anarchy? If we go to the dictionary, it will tell us that anarchy is simply political disorder and confusion, the absence of any cohesive principle or common standard or purpose. I ask you, is this what we're seeing in the current protests? Just disorder and confusion and no common purpose? Well, people are talking about anti-Semitic slogans and hatred being aimed toward the Jewish people in all this anti-Israel, pro-Hamas language and protest. But I think it's a lot more than that. Anarchy is a political theory that believes the community is best organized by voluntary cooperation of individuals rather than government. That we just have some kind of voluntary cooperation of people rather than government. They regard all governments as being coercive by nature. Now, you as a listener, you may not be aware of this, but there's been a movement known as anarchism since the, mid-1800s. Anarchists, over the decades, they've defied laws and orders and social conventions while confronting authorities. They've been loud, defiant, uncontrollable, just unruly. They think they're in pursuit of some greater economic, social, and political equality for all human beings. Anarchists, they believe that the political rule is constituted not solely to protect and enhance the life of humans, but also to enforce inequality for the benefit of a minority at the expense of many others. Emma Goldman was a self-avowed American anarchist and defined this kind of political thinking in 1910 as the philosophy of a new order based on liberty, unrestricted by man-made laws. You get that? Unrestricted. In other words, no laws. So anarchists believe that all forms of government, be it a liberal democratic government or a socialist state, that all are based on violence and coercion. To sum it up, they believe that government equals tyranny. Government equals tyranny. During the latter part of the 1900s, here in the United States, a number of anti-establishment groups emerged and were spearheaded by anarchists. We had anti-nuclear groups, we had gray rights groups, as well as other groups. The longest running anarchist publication in North America is a publication called The Fifth Estate. The Fifth Estate. And this publication generally shares anarchist, and anti-authoritarian outlooks in their articles. This publication, along with some others, are responsible for bringing new ideas such as white privilege to the forefront. You sometimes wonder where these ideas come from. American anarchists have become increasingly noticeable in protests. They were clearly involved in the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle in 1999, and according to the publication Rolling Stone in 2011, it was anarchists who were behind the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it's been reported that it's anarchists who are behind the Antifa protest in Portland, and their later involvement in the Black Lives Matter protest. It seems that whenever public protests break out, sometimes with violent behavior, the mainstream media are often quick to refer to anarchy and anarchists, calling protesters anarchists because they're just a bunch of lawless hooligans creating chaos and pointless violence. But as I tried to point out here in just these few minutes, it's really a radical and revolutionary political philosophy. Now, if you were a political science major at a university, you probably spent some time studying some of the writings of anarchists. The etymology of the term anarchy traces back to the Greek word anarchia, which means without rulers and without authority. It stands for the absence of denomination or hierarchy or any kind of power over others. Anarchism is a process where authority and denomination is replaced with some kind of non-hierarchical, horizontal structures with voluntary, non-governmental, but voluntary associations between human beings. It's a form of social organizations with a set of principles such as self-organization and autonomy and solidarity and direct democracy and egalitarianism and mutual aids. Based on these principles and values, anarchism rejects a capitalist economy and any kind of a nation state that is governed through a representative democracy. In other words, America, capitalistic America represented by a representative democracy. It's some kind of a political philosophy that aspires to combine the best parts of liberalism with the best parts of communism. There's been a long list of anarchist thinkers who've written about this concept since the mid-19th century, as I said earlier. The theme that runs through their writings is that laws and legislation are created by the rich and powerful for the rich and powerful. Now, does this sound somewhat familiar to some of the things you've heard in the news story? Just last year in January 2023, the Atlanta police shot and killed a man who's referred to as an eco-anarchist, Manuel Esteban Paz Terán. He was part of the Stop Cop City protest. You may have seen something in the news about this protest going on in Atlanta. Then in February of this year, an anarchist and a United States Air Force serviceman, Aaron Bushnell, burned himself to death outside the Israeli Israel in Washington, D.C. Now, some of you may be listening to this podcast and maybe you have a tendency to agree with the basic idea that the power of our national government and state governments are coercive, especially in light of the news stories about the politicization of the FBI and the justice system and other agencies of the federal government. But look, we've got to be careful that we don't damn all government over some failures of today. Yes, I agree. There may be deep injustices in the U.S. criminal justice system, and reform is needed. I think that's part of why we have elections, when reform is needed. But we cannot abolish federal and state powers just because there are some current problems. Without a federal government, we would not be able to guarantee some, certain public goods, education, health care, transportation systems. And, without federal and state, even local laws, we would ask, well, then who would protect us? Who would protect us? Who would enforce agreements to protect, people's legitimate interests? For example, let's say you and I make an agreement with one another, and I pay you to do a particular job, like paint my house. And let's say I pay you the full amount up front to paint my house, but you rip me off and you don't complete the job. Under the anarchist ideas, how would I protect my interests when there are no legal sanctions, laws, or deterrents? What recourse would I have, if there are no laws to enforce them? What really stops everyone from cheating another person? Whether it's democracy or anarchy, cheating customers is a bad business model. It should be self-correcting, because you would never get repeat business, and surely word would spread about your shady practices, and you'd have a difficult time earning a livelihood. Our current system does not prevent that kind of thing from happening. The federal, state, and local governments, they're not necessarily a deterrent for people who want to cheat. And yes, there are many studies that have demonstrated that most people want to do the right thing, but they want to be protected from that small minority that are prone to crime and abuse. In the midst of the ongoing protests across the country, it's being reported that there are left-wing organizations providing the funding and training. And as we talked about earlier, many of the participants, that they don't even understand what the issues are. And it's for those reasons that I think there's a much more sinister influence that's extraordinarily dangerous to our society. It's the ideology of anarchists who've been behind many of the protests in our country. I was in Maracaibo, Venezuela, when the Marxist left-wing government was taking over. I'd been invited to speak to the medical staff and faculty at a large university hospital in that city. A few minutes before I was scheduled to give my presentation, a doctor pulled me aside and pleaded with me to say something about how their corrupt government was stealing funds for patient care to the point where they lacked even basic medicines for their patients. It was obvious that a corrupt government had taken over Venezuela. There was nothing that I could say in my presentation to directly address this problem, but I obliquely referred to the importance of protecting funding for patient care. After that experience, I reflected on the scriptural teachings in Romans 13. The Apostle Paul writes Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Wow, that's the Apostle Paul talking to us. There have been corrupt, evil governments from the beginning of time. Paul himself had experienced the corruption of the Roman government when he wrote these words. I think the answer is that Paul is telling us that God is sovereign over every earthly authority and that God will deal with the authorities at the right time. At the right time. Paul went on to say, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right and for those who, but for those who do wrong. Paul's telling us that the rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but the terror is for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free of the one in authority? Then do what is right and you will be commended. Those are the words of Paul. Paul was trying to tell us that even in godless governments, courts regularly settle cases involving patents and land titles, and labor relations, and contracts in equitable manners. Regulators often serve to, protect the environment and enforce workplace safety and ensure equal access to housing. And for the most part, police generally apprehend criminals and assist the innocent. Authorities in business and government in the workplace sometimes get things devastatingly wrong and sometimes abuse power for selfish reasons. Those kind of actions sometimes cause us to forget that God is moving in our lives and that his power lies over, behind, and through all creation. Paul was writing this advice to Roman Christians who were living in the center of the most powerful human authorities that the Western world had ever known. He was warning Christians, do not rebel against the Roman injustice, but to obey the law and pay your taxes and fees. Paul describes the Roman authorities as God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on wrongdoers. Today, here in our world in contemporary times, in many countries, tax evasion is commonplace. In those countries, the government loses its legitimacy in the eyes of both taxpayers and tax evaders. The result is instability and stunned economic growth and human development. Even in these countries, though, it's important for Christians to pay their taxes and join in efforts to monitor the government's use of funds. It may take decades to reform government, but as Paul teaches in Romans 12, do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. That's what Christian people can do. Now, as I begin to wind this podcast down, let me say this to you. We are approaching a presidential election in the United States in November. And Christians, God-fearing people, Christians should feel a responsibility to participate in this democratic process and to vote for individuals that they feel will carry out God's justice. But once those votes have been counted, we have a responsibility to obey the authorities and the laws. Even if we disagree, we must still obey. The words of the apostle in Romans 13 imply that, yes, we're to obey legitimate authorities, even while we may be working to change unjust laws and regulations through democratic means. The truth is the majority of Americans today feel that the incumbent president and his administration are the worst leaders in the United States in modern times. And there is tremendous political tension in our country, and it is intense. And there's nothing wrong with speaking out about the policies of our federal governments and state governments. However, whether it's the federal government or state government, or it's something at work or school, Christians have got to be committed to believing that change will occur not because we express outrage, but because God is sovereign over all. As we begin to conclude, let me just say that I'm pleading with listeners to keep your rage over public abuses and injustices under control. Make sure your outrage is aimed at the laws, the regulations, and the policies, not the individuals that God has allowed to serve, no matter how you feel about them. Remember, Christians, people of God, are called to love everyone, even our enemies. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you'll be back with us on the next podcast. God bless you.